OMO, Oil Mining Ordinance, sudah ada 1958. Dia tidak di-repeal. Bermakna undang-undang itu masih wujud di mana Sarawak ada mempunyai sedikit sebanyak kuasa dari sudut mining, dan oil dan gas ni adalah industri mining.
The state of Sarawak in Malaysia has been embroiled in a long-standing dispute with Petronas, the national oil company. At the heart of this debate is which of them owns the rights to oil and gas resources found on the continental shelf of Sarawak's coast.
The Queen in Council in 1954 telah mengagiskan ini boundary Sarawak. Jadi kita punya boundary is still within continental shelf.
The issue is rooted both in Sarawak's unique history and in the Petroleum Development Act in 1974, which grants Petronas exclusive ownership of all onshore and offshore petroleum resources throughout Malaysia. However, Sarawak also claims a right to resources off its coast, tracing its right to the state's Oil and Mining Ordinance of 1958 and a colonial order that predates it. The state asserts that in 1954, an order by Queen Elizabeth II expanded Sarawak's boundaries to include the continental shelf. According to Sarawak, an extension of up to 200 nautical miles from its boundaries existed when Malaysia was formed in 1963. This disputed area in the South China Sea is rich in oil and gas. It holds some 60% of Malaysia's known reserves and is essential to the country's production of liquefied natural gas, which forms a significant part of the national economy. Recently, Sarawak has demanded a greater share of the revenue derived from these resources. The state argues that the 5% royalty payment prescribed by an agreement entered with Petronas is not fair compensation given the scale and value of the resources within its boundaries. Former Petronas chairman Tunku Razali Hamzah disagrees with Sarawak's stance, saying the matter was not even discussed when the 1963 Malaysia Agreement was drawn up. Tunku Razali argues that Sarawak should honor its royalty agreement with Petronas.
All that we want to make sure that there is no quarrel between the states and the federal government. So we make sure that the payment is the same for everybody, whether you have oil or you don't have oil. But if you find oil, we'll give you 5% of the value of the oil. And who formulated this? It was Rahman Yaakob after he met the cabinet in Sarawak. And we discussed that with all the state governments after referring to the federal cabinet, and they agreed that is the best way to go.
Rahman Yaakob negotiated and agreed that 5% goes to Sarawak.
I mean, you can't go back and forth, you know. An agreement is an agreement, isn't it?
The Territorial Sea Act 2012 was introduced to comply with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Malaysia joined in 1982. UNCLOS defines a 200 nautical mile limit as applicable to a sovereign nation, in this case Malaysia, not its individual states. Sarawak also relies on the federal constitution for support.
Dalam perlumbaan kita kata, boundary cannot be changed unless with the consent of DUN, express consent, dan Conference of Rulers. Jadi kita punya boundary is still within continental shelf.
Sarawak contends that neither of these conditions have been met, rendering any changes to its boundaries unconstitutional. Maritime lawyer Liu Tek Huat, however, offers a different perspective. He suggests that the term continental shelf remained undefined in 1954.
Sarawak claims that the 1954 Order in Council extends its boundaries to include the continental shelf, which it says go up to 200 nautical miles from the edge of its territorial waters. But the 200 nautical miles length is not specifically stated in the Order in Council itself.
According to Liu, the term continental shelf was defined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which Malaysia inked in 1982 and ratified 4 years later.
The right to the continental shelf of Malaysia's coasts, including Sarawak's, belong to the entire nation. On that basis, the Petroleum Development Act of 1974 and the Territorial Sea Act 2012 are good law.
Clearly, multiple issues arise touching on historical boundaries, state rights, and federal authority. Unless determined with finality by the courts, any dispute between Petronas and Sarawak will likely remain unresolved. Perhaps the solution lies in a fair long-term arrangement respecting, on the one hand, the right of all Malaysians to shared resources, and, on the other, Sarawak's own rights, premised on its history as well as current and future needs. Danish Raja Reza, FMT News.